So Jeremy pretty much gave the introduction to the MSC, the seafood eco-label in general, so I wouldn't go too much into it. But from the economics point of view, what's interesting about particular seafood labeling and the certification that comes with it is that, well, first of all, it's invisible to consumers. You can't tell whether the seafood is sustainable or not by just either looking at it, smelling at it, or even after you cook it and taste it. You can't really tell. At the same time, as Jeremy pointed out, achieving the certification, also maintaining it, as in renewal of the certification, is not cheap. In fact, it's quite expensive. And so, in some sense, the consumers can't tell by just looking at the product, and of course, and because it's so costly to get there, there's some way has to be done so that the consumers actually know that this is a sustainable seafood, and they're able to differentiate a seafood, that certified seafood, from the other, should I say, a conventional products. And that's why the label is used for that purpose. So there are many labels in the market today, as you know, and I'm just showing some of the examples here. The point I wanted to make is seafood eco-labeling working? That's sort of the initial interest that I had towards this whole topic of seafood certification. And there are two reasons I think this question is valid to ask. One is, well, obviously, it isn't just 4 labels in the market right now. There's actually hundreds of labels of all sorts of kinds, as you can see, from organic to Forest Stewardship Council to Fair Trade certified, and all those other types of eco-labels are out there in the market. So there's a question whether consumers really able to pick up the MSC label or any kind of a seafood certification label and act on it. And another question is that there's a big difference between, in my view, the seafood label and the, say, organic or the Energy Star labels. And that is, the seafood certification, the seafood label lacks the private benefit that consumers who purchase that product would enjoy. And that is a big difference between organic, which you might have some health implications. It might be healthier, it might be less chemicals on it, so therefore you think it's safe. It might be more nutritious. Energy Star, of course, lets you save the energy cost. All of that is sort of like a personal benefit, a private benefit that you can appropriate by spending maybe a little extra money to purchase those goods. That's not the case with the seafood. It's literally only the knowledge that you're doing something good to the planet, to the fish, to the society, but it doesn't taste any better. At least the certification doesn't carry anything about taste better or anything. It's not necessarily fresher. In fact, that's why I don't purchase seafood at Whole Foods. They might have a label one, but they're so looking old on their counter, which does not, prompt me to purchase it. So I'd rather go to Belmont or somewhere else to buy my seafood. And so that's the challenge. And so not surprisingly, a lot of research in the past has been on the consumers. And some studies have done using the actual purchase data, say scanner data from the grocery stores, and some did what we call the hypothetical survey analysis or studies, asking people how much are you willing to buy if such labeled product is available. And a lot of those studies have found, I think rule of thumb would be about 10% or so of the price premium, meaning a lot of consumers either indicated, they said, or they've actually shown through their purchasing behavior that up to about 10% or so more expensive, if the certified seafood is about 10% more expensive, they will still purchase those products. So there's certainly, I think, generally speaking, there's some consensus that yes, this price premium can exist at the retail level. The question, of course, is, as Jeremy pointed out, the cost of getting certification and maintaining it is mostly borne by the fishermen or the fishing industry at large. So real question here is, well, maybe the retail side is getting this price premium, but how much is that actually is getting into the hands of the producers? In this case, will be the fishermen. And therefore, the question of this part of the talk is, do the price premium found at the retail trickle down to fishers? Okay, so whatever that extra money you got in the retail, does it come down to the boats? And the way we'll do this is we will analyze the change in the ex-vessel price. So the ex-vessel price is the actual price, the money that the fisherman receives at the dock. And we basically, roughly speaking, we want to know how does that price change, basically before and after the certification. And we will do a little bit of a more slightly sophisticated analysis so that we will be able to identify how much of that change can be attributed to the fact that you got a certification. Now, this is because, well, actually, I'll show you the graph actually before I explain that. So the method that we chose to use is something called the difference in difference approach. And it basically combines two types of differencing. One is, as you might all imagine straightforwardly, is the before and after. So in year X, a fishery gets certified, so we compare, in the most simplistic case, the ex-vessel price, and I'm old-timer, so I like to use this actually. So ex-vessel price before the certification took place, let's say that's this much, okay? And then we compare that with the price, ex-vessel price after the certification. And in this particular example, the post-certification price is this, represented by that height, and therefore that green square represents the increasing ex-vessel price. Now, of course, if you're looking at it, you might say, well, there are so many other things that could affect the price. Did the economy overall improved between these two time periods? Or did one of the celebrity chefs basically promoted this fishery for whatever reason, and therefore all of a sudden the demand went up? Or did the regulation came into place and they imposed a really limited amount of harvests that are allowed, and then therefore the supply went down dramatically, that the market simply responded by having a higher price? So there are a lot of things that could have gone, and trying to control for all of that and trying to tease out only the effect coming from the certification in itself is quite a challenge. One sort of quicker way to solve that problem is to compare with the non-certified fishery. So very much like the Jeremy's idea, looking for the control fishery that are similar enough, but only difference is that one is certified and one is not. And we also do the same thing. And call that a fishery X, that is the similar enough but non-certified fisheries. And we also look at the ex-vessel price before and after that when the certification took place. And let's say that little red square is that observed increase in price. And so the idea is then, see, this is why I wanted to do it, because I did this animation. And if I had done what the Jeremy did, I wouldn't be able to show this, right? Basically take that difference, so that was the first difference, the green and the red box. And now we compare the two boxes. That's the second differencing. That's why it's called difference in difference. And that it will be the estimate for the certification effect. Okay. Some key assumption for this to work is that the two fisheries need to be similar enough. And in this case, similar in the sense of in terms of the factors that are affecting the ex-vessel price. So naturally, perhaps the species ought to be same or similar at least. And we also picked geographically, close is a good thing, because then we would expect that the ex-vessel market are affected by similar factors, etc. So the fisheries that we actually analyzed are these three. One is the salmon. So the treatment group, the one that's certified, is the Alaska salmon. And we also break this down by the 5 species, the Chinook, chum, coho, pink, and sockeye. The control are the British Columbia salmon fishery, and they were not certified for the most part of our sample period. Our sample period, the data that we have, range from 97 for the salmon, and also for the halibut, to 2012. And just wanted to mention this up front, that British Columbia did eventually got their MSC certification as well. It's just that it happened either 2009, I believe, for the salmon. No, maybe halibut. And 2010 for salmon. So since our data ranged only up to 2012, we figured that British Columbia's certification is late in the period enough that we can use them for the most part as the control. But as you will see, we also try to control for the fact that the British Columbia also got the certification later in the year. The second fishery is the halibut. Again, the treatment group is the Alaska, the one that got certified, and the British Columbia is the one that's the control. The third one and this is kind of interesting, is the Kyoto flathead flounder fisheries in Kyoto, Japan. As you can see, both the treatment and the control are the same fishery, so they're both actually MSC certified. The difference is one is using the label as they go up through the supply chain, whereas the other does not. And I'll give you a little more background here. So this fishery is pursued by the vessels that are based in 4 ports, sort of surrounding the bay, roughly speaking the bay. And each of those boats basically land in their home port, and each home port has its own wholesale market. The Maizuru port, which is one of the 4 ports, is the only one that has a dealer who is with the chain of custody certification, and therefore they can actually affix the label when they buy the fish from the fisherman and ship it through the market, the supply chain. Whereas the other 3 ports, despite the fact that they're receiving the fish that are certified, they just don't bother to actually affix the label and market it as such. So the third fishery here is not so much one is certified, one is not. They're both certified. It's just one being explicit about trying to transmit that information. The other one just did not. Okay? So in some sense, that's like a more interesting case of whether actually carrying that label, not just the fact of the certification, but actually telling the consumers, informing the consumers that information may have any effect. Okay. Just quickly going through the descriptive statistics gives you a little bit of sense of what the data looks like. So here in salmon, comparing Alaska and British Columbia, there's 2 things I wanted to mention. One is amongst those 5 subspecies of salmon, you can see that Chinook is the one, also known as the king salmon, the one that commands the highest price. So that's on average $2.50 per pound is the ex-vessel price. I can't remember, the retail price must be over $20+ per pound, I would think, for the king salmon. So you kind of imagine what sort of margin that the market is getting, and not, the fishermen not getting much. So the Chinook is one of the most popular and the most expensive one, and followed by coho and sockeye. The chum and the pink are the one that's more considered as more abundant and also somewhat a lower value. For whatever reason, that's what the market sort of sees it. And the trend is similar for the British Columbia salmon as well. And then, of course, we have the halibut down here too. Price, British Columbia on average commands a little higher price, but not terribly too high. And this one is the flounder. Okay, if it shows, here we go. Here's the flounder. So those are the 4 ports that I mentioned up there. The one with the red double line is the one that actually affixes the label. The other 3 is the one that doesn't. Again, the Maizuru actually commands somewhat a lower, on average, in this case it's a per yen per kilo, but unit price, I just put it that way. It's a lower unit price compared to the other ports, probably the exception of the very bottom ones, but the others commands a much higher price. And I'll come back to that, this sort of status quo price and what that might have an impact on whether there's that trickle-down effect or not. A little more descriptive statistics here. Here's the price trend, ex-vessel price trend for these salmon species. And basically the point I want to make is, one, for the most part, meaning for the most of the species, the 2 lines, the one Alaska, the other the British Columbia, they seem to tag along fairly well. So that's sort of encouraging. That's a good sign that the control, using British Columbia as a control, might be actually justified. At least it's not showing some red sign that maybe that's not a good idea. The only exception might be the sockeye, where you see the trend seems to be somewhat quite different between the 2 fisheries. And again, you will see in my results that, yes, sockeye is going to be a little bit problematic case. If we look for the other 2 fisheries, halibut, again, if you just look at the trend-wise, mostly going hand in hand, maybe except for the last few years. For the flounder, so this red one, trending almost at the very bottom, is the Maizuru one. That's the one with the label on it. So again, 4 ports, the trends are more or less common throughout this whole time horizon. So just to demonstrate that the choice of control more or less is fine in most of these cases that we looked at. This is just to show that this is the estimation model that we ran. Just wanted to point out is that if you remember, I mentioned that the British Columbia also got certified in their salmon and halibut during the latter years of our estimation period. And so we basically tried to incorporate that through some of the interaction terms that we included in our model over here as well. So these 2009, 2010 basically is trying to capture if there's any impact from the fact that the British Columbia also got certified. And we tried to assume less about how the error term, the structure of the error term and whatnot, and so try to be as general as possible. So with that fishery chosen, the estimation model up, so what are the bottom line results? And here we have it. So the one in red is one that we like, meaning positive and statistically speaking at least significantly different from 0, meaning that number probably means something. So for instance, the Chinook, on average, at the mean, it is basically saying by having a certification, there's about 23 or so cents plus of the ex-vessel price. But since it is not statistically significantly different from 0, the proper really way to infer this is it probably doesn't have any effect. The mean might be 0.234, but it ranges so widely that it could just be 0. Whereas for the chum, it was statistically significant, so it is more, we feel more comfortable saying that by having a certification, the ex-vessel price for the chum goes up on average by about 23 cents per pound. Okay? And that similar story for the pink. The only sort of naughty salmon was the sockeye, which was statistically significant but was minus. So if you read that number literally, it means by having a certification, you actually drop the ex-vessel price by about nearly 60 cents. And if you recall that little price graph that I had, that was the case where using a British Columbia sockeye salmon was didn't quite look okay to use it as a control because the two trends were somewhat quite different. And so there's a bit of that. Maybe there's something about not choosing a right control, at least for the sockeye salmon. But for the others, it's fairly looking okay. Coho came out negative, but that was not significantly different from 0, so we just call that as 0, no impact. For the flounder and the halibut, flounder actually is much cleaner results. It was positive, and this is yen, so 124 yen, not dollars. So 124 yen translates to about $1.10 or something like that. Okay, so having a certification, this is not certification. This is actually certification and affixing that label, right? Actually had this impact of about $1 plus in their ex-vessel price. Now halibut, it didn't show any statistical significance when we're looking between these two periods. And remember, the 2009 is when British Columbia also got the certification. And when we include all the way up to that whole time period, we saw some positive, but that's huge. $2.51 per pound after, with the certification seems a little large. And here again, we are a little not yet comfortable enough to say that yes, that is the impact of the certification. But again, if you recall the price graph, the halibut was mostly trending in a similar way up until the very last few years. There was this huge spike in British Columbia, actually, I think it was. It was a blue line, maybe it was Alaska. So there was some break in the trend towards the end of the year. So maybe by separating the estimation right at that point when the trend seems to have changed somehow, might be the reason why we're getting a different results in terms of statistical significance, and also the number itself just seems a little bit too much. Because the average per pound ex-vessel price for the halibut was about $2.60 for Alaska, and then $3 something for British Columbia. So to have another additional $2.50 is just doesn't sound right. So here I think we might need a little more digging into the data, or just simply that we just didn't have not good enough data for that. But so with all that caveats in place, a few conclusions / discussion. So just as a summary, the increase in ex-vessel price was observed. Chum and pink salmon, I think for those two, we're fairly confident about it. And also the flounder, I think, was kind of clean, so we're fairly confident about that. Halibut, like I said, is a little questionable, although at least in terms of the statistical results, that's what we got. And as you can see, I didn't even bother to mention, but of course, sockeye was a little bit of troubling results. What can we sort of take away, looking at these one that had a positive and significant impact? Is there any commonality, common theme that we can see? And one is for the salmon and the flounder is that the two species in salmon was the one that had a lower value. And for the flounder, the Maizu report are the one that usually commands a lower average ex-vessel price. So there might be something about starting off with a lower price gives you some room to add on to the premium. And I was thinking, what other market there may be that might have some similar trend. And I like cars, so one thing I came up with, I think about how much are you willing to pay extra for, say, hybrid or electrical car. Good for the environment, right? I save you some gas fuel costs and all that, but that's fine. And if you think about the most popular hybrid, the Prius, I thought, okay, what's the equivalent to the Prius if the other Toyota, the gasoline-based cars or only gas-based cars? And I think it's the Corolla. It probably comes to the closest. It's probably not Camry, right? In terms of the size and the comfort level and all that stuff. And Corolla is fairly, it's a cheaper car amongst the lineup of the Toyota. So in some sense, bringing in the car that's equivalent to Corolla, but it's hybrid, it's more ecological and whatnot, the consumers might be willing to pay a little extra to get that extra, good feeling that this is a hybrid and etc. And indeed, Prius is much higher than Corolla, but people still buy it. Now, I know for the fact that the Porsche is coming up with a hybrid or the electrical car. Then the question is, how much extra are you willing to pay for the Porsche electrical version of it? Okay, and I also know that the Mercedes is coming up, but at least they produce one, a completely electrical car that has the equivalent of 600 horsepower, whatever that is. How much extra are you willing to pay for it? It seems to me that when the base price is so high, you don't really feel like adding extra just to get that eco-friendliness on top of it. So maybe that's something about here too. Chinook, the king salmon, is already so high in terms of per pound price at the retail, but also at the ex-vessel, right? Maybe adding a certification doesn't really give you that extra premium that people are willing to pay, or at least that the fishermen can actually receive. Whereas if it's a lower value one, maybe there's a room for it. So maybe that's what we're finding out too. Now, as for the salmon, I would add another point is that those two, chum and pink, are typically frozen and shipped to European markets. And as Jeremy's presentation pointed out, one of the key factors that sort of sorting fisheries, which one gets certified and don't get certified, you remember him saying that one is whether the fish is targeted towards the European market or not. So maybe we're picking up something similar here as well, that those two salmon species are the one that's mostly shipped to European markets, and therefore maybe they're the one receiving more benefit through certification. Something about halibut. The only thing I can say about halibut, if there is some genuine impact there, is that perhaps analysis up to 2009 didn't give enough time in the halibut market to actually realize the benefit. So once you extend it to 2012, you picked up something. Maybe. But still, by just looking at the magnitude of that impact, I'm still very much skeptical as to if that really means anything. And lastly, for the flounder, like I said, these are both certified fish that the both treatment and control were both certified. But the only difference is whether you bother to communicate that to the consumers. And seeing the flounder's result seems to suggest that yes, it is very important to actually communicate that to the consumers. And that actually not only consumers pay the premium, but then the fisherman also gets a little bit of extra in their ex-vessel price. So thank you very much. I just wanted to mention my co-author Kathy Roheim and Adam, who was, this did come out from his major paper as well. So I wanted to mention both of those guys for the work too. So there's my contact information. So thank you very much.